Our first question is from Kent Wiley. We're going to go ahead and jump into this. He says, "Hi Curtis, since finding your video about the Sound Devices 633 earlier this year, I've been enjoying your videos on sight and particularly sound. You've done a number of sessions on timecode, and as primarily a camera guy who shoots on DSLRs and now a C300, it's something that is still unfamiliar territory. I understand the theory and practicality, but haven't entered the gear arena yet. More and more of my shoots are working with other photographers, so we are running several cameras and possibly several recorders. I can see that the editorial task would be simplified considerably if we were to utilize timecode on all our devices. It appears as if several of the manufacturers have entered the affordable range for DSLR shooters. I wonder if you could offer an opinion about the relative merits of the Ambient NanoLockit, Timecode Systems Wave, and the Tentacle Sync Timecode Generator." All right, let's do that first, and then we'll come back as another question on top of that. So first of all, I have actually created a spreadsheet here, right here. I'll go ahead and leave a link to this along with the session here so you can go and have a closer look at it. It represents some of the things that I'm familiar with. That I'm not familiar with all timecode generator solutions out there. I am familiar with the Tentacle Sync. I've used that personally and own one, as you can see here. Also, I also am an owner of a TIG Q28, which is a little timecode generator made by Moze gear. We'll talk about that in just a second here. And then we're also going to add in the Wave and the NanoLockit like you asked. So let me just, this spreadsheet will go through the details. Let me just highlight a few things. I would say the original Tentacle Sync, which is what I have here, which is what I've been using primarily, is a great little device. You can now get them for a single one for about $215 in the US. And it does a nice job. It does, I would say it's sort of, feature set is, if I had to summarize the feature set, it's affordable, simple sync, and it has some included software which is very usable and very helpful. One thing that's important to keep in mind, when you are going to be using any sort of timecode generator device with a DSLR or any camera that does not have a dedicated timecode input, and instead you're using a microphone input, you're going to need some software in post that can read the timecode. Here's why. When you use an audio or microphone input, the timecode is actually being saved on that audio track as an analog audio signal. It sounds a lot like the modems of the 1990s when we used to use dial-up modems. Now, the reason this is important, you have to have some sort of software that can read that timecode that's written to an audio track and translate it into timecode. So there are 3 apps that I know of that are capable of doing that. One is the Tentacle Studio Sync app that comes with the Tentacle Sync if you buy one. So you can also buy it independently. I think it's $100 and some, but it also comes with any of the Tentacle Syncs. Another application is DaVinci Resolve. I believe both the Lite version and the Studio version. It's actually now called just DaVinci Resolve and DaVinci Resolve Studio. I believe both have the capability of reading audio timecode. And then the third one that I'm aware of is Avid Media Composer. So if you are going to be using one of these or any of these timecode devices with a DSLR or any other camera that only has microphone inputs, you're going to need to consider the software that you're going to need. So if you don't edit or color with DaVinci Resolve and you don't want DaVinci Resolve in your workflow, and the same with Media Composer, then you're probably going to want to look at Tentacle Sync or use the Tentacle Sync software, which can read any standard SMPTE timecode that's written by any device. So really important factor to keep in mind. So I would not hesitate to buy more of these. So I've been very happy with those. Number 2, they just announced the Tentacle Sync E, which is their 2nd generation version of this. And in fact, we have, that's a picture of it here on screen. I talked to Ulrich, who is one of the fellows here. This is Ulrich. Talked to him at NAB this year. And it looks like a pretty interesting device. What they have done to this over the original version is they've added the ability to monitor each of the individual timecode generators via Bluetooth on your phone or tablet. Specifically, it's iOS, so it's not on Android. That's kind of a nice little feature. You still have to sync using a cable, so you still have to jam sync by using cables like you would in most cases up until today. So, but we don't know the price on it yet. We don't know exactly when it will be available. He said before the end of the year. It has some nice features, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. The next one up is the NanoLockit, which actually I think Ambient Timecode is the name of the company. They announced this at NAB. This one looks really, really interesting to me as well. It's about $300 per NanoLockit device, but this has some additional features. It actually has the ability to sync across NanoLockits or other Lockit devices, so any of the other devices in their system wirelessly. So instead of having to jam sync all of them together or sync all of them together using cables, you can now do that wirelessly and then use a cable to hook it up to your to your cameras from there. So that's an interesting option as well. I mentioned the Moze Gear TIG Q28. This one's really nice. It does not have any wireless features. It does not have a readout screen. It's very simple. I think the really thing about these is that they're super tough. This thing is incredibly solid aluminum, and the control, instead of using an iOS app like you would for the Tentacle Sync, you actually hook this up to your phone via cable. And the next generation one, I think you're still going to have to hook it up to phone to do the jam syncing. But I think you can actually do the setup of just the settings via Bluetooth. This one is all switches that use a little screwdriver. They're kind of like a tiny little switches in there. It's documented on the entire package surface. So you know exactly what the settings are, even if you've forgotten and you haven't used it for a while. It runs on 2 AAA batteries, so you can replace those. And the AAA batteries, how long do they last? I'm trying to remember. 16 plus hours, so pretty much a production day. You should be able to get through any production day. With that, if you're working more than a 16-hour production day, you need to maybe consider joining a union. In any case, this has been a really great device for me as well. Kind of a different approach. Again, no wireless features, but just a simple, really solid solution for timecode. They also, Moze Gear also introduced a brand new one at NAB called the TIG Qubit, and you can see it here on screen. It is super tiny, so it's pretty much the same thing as this, except super tiny. It does have an inbuilt battery that's sort of considered a backup battery that'll last 4.5 hours, but then you feed DC power to it. So the idea is here that you'd be mounting it to a camera, and you'd be able to get power from the battery system for the camera. So this is a little bit more specialized, probably not as useful for DSLR setups, but that's another thing to consider. And then the other one you asked about was the Timecode Systems Wave. This one's in a very different league. So price-wise, you can see here, this one comes in at $926, so it's a very different league, but it also does some things that the others don't. Specifically, it has very extensive wireless sync options, and not only wireless sync options, but also Genlock and Wordclock. So you can actually maintain sync across devices if you're using multiple of these by using a wireless signal to keep them in sync. So even if there is drift, it's going to correct that on a real-time basis. So it's a pretty interesting device. It's very full-featured. It's got a screen readout. It's got a sort of an encoder here to make the settings, and it can be in a master or slave in terms of maintaining the time code amongst other devices. So it's really a pretty neat device. You have to be you're going to invest seriously if you're going to go with that system. So again, as I mentioned, it's kind of in a different league altogether, but interesting option there. So there's kind of an overview of some of the options I'm familiar with. I haven't used all of these. Again, I've used the Tentacle Sync and I've used the TIG Q28, but a lot of them all work on the similar principle. I'll have a link to the spreadsheet if you're interested in that. Now, there's one also out there that I was hoping to add to this list, but I couldn't find it. And Greg Palmer, if you're watching this, if you could tell me again the information you did about the system you're using. It's also a wireless system. It looked pretty interesting. I think it was less expensive than the Wave. I don't know if it was as full-featured as the Wave, but it was kind of an interesting option as well. And I'll add that to this spreadsheet here. Greg, if you wouldn't mind sending that over to me or contacting me via email or leaving a comment here below. So great question. All right, let's head on back here. One other question from Kent. I'm specifically looking to sync devices such as a C300, a GH4, and an H4n, and or the new Sound Devices MixPre 6, and wonder if the standard 2-device set that many of the manufacturers offer is really adequate for a 3-camera recorder setup. One could be jam synced, but they all should have a timecode device attached at all times, shouldn't they? I gather the 2-pack typically offered is for 1 camera plus 1 sound recorder. Yeah, I think that's true. It depends on what you're doing, though. If you do have, for the devices you've mentioned, yes, I think generally you're going to need 1 for each device, each recorder and each camera. Technically, the Canon C300 does have a timecode clock in it, so you could jam sync it and then disconnect this item, but what I have heard, this is hearsay, I don't know, I haven't used it personally, but that clock drifts pretty quickly. It's not going to be nearly as accurate as something like one of these. So you probably will still want another one for the C300. So yes, the answer is yes, you will need 1 for each of the recorders, especially if you're using an H4n, and and for each of the cameras. Now, there are different circumstances. If you're using a sound device as 633, for example, if at some point you find yourself in that situation, that has a very capable timecode generator built into it. So that one does not need to have one of these attached to it at all times. In fact, it can act as the master clock that you jam sync all of the other generators to, and then connect those to the cameras. And that's how I often work. So, all right, I think we got your question answered there, Kent. Thanks for the question. Really appreciate it. Next one is from Simon Harris. Hello, Curtis. I'm interested in your isotope compression techniques. Please could you explain how you use isotope to achieve compression on dialogue tracks? Many thanks, Simon Harris. Simon, I assume you are talking about Izotope RX, which is typically where I do my work. RX itself does not have a compressor built in, technically. It has a leveler, which is kind of a module that's for other types of things. It doesn't work really well, I don't think, for a single isolated dialogue track. I think it works better when you have 2 different people speaking to the same microphone or into a mix that's been recorded, and they're at different levels. It tends to work better at kind of leveling those up a little bit. But I don't generally like to use it in lieu of a compressor for loudness normalization. So I guess I can walk through really quickly. What I've been using is I have been using isotopes, 2 things. Either Izotope Nectar 2, which is what you see here, or I've been using the Izotope Ozone 7 compressor, which actually they call this plugin Dynamics. It's a little bit more than just a compressor. It's also a limiter. I've been using one of those 2. I have demonstrated how I use the Ozone, actually it was Ozone 6 when I did the demonstration last time, but the compressor hasn't changed in any sort of substantive way. But then lately I've been using the Nectar compressor instead, because this one has both a compressor and a de-esser. So it's just a single band compressor, but it is a de-esser. So for example, in this audio right here, this is just a clip of dialogue. I'll just run through this really quickly. Right now and again, this is I'm not compressing here to change the timbre of the sound of the dialogue. I'm just compressing here to loudness normalize it. So for web, what I want to do is, because this is a mono dialogue track, I want to get this integrated loudness, LKFS, which is the same as LUFS, up to -19. Right now we're at -33.6. We have 10 dB of headroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to -24 dB. We'll run through that process here real quick. All right, now that we're at -24, and my goal is to get to -19. I've only got 1 dB of headroom right now, so that means I need an additional 5 dB of headroom, plus I want to plus tack on another decibel there because I want my true peak to sit at -1 dB true peak. So I need 6 decibels of additional headroom, so I'm going to use a compressor to do that. Now, if I use the top of this window here, if I set the threshold to -10, I'd be compressing all of this. I'm going to go maybe -9. Again, my goal here is just to really manage these transients, but not cut into the body of the dialogue, because I don't want to change how it sounds. So I'm going to go with -9 as my threshold. Just go ahead and drag this down to -9. In my case, for dialogue, I often leave, when I'm trying to manage transients, I should say, I leave the attack really fast, the release, so in other words, at 0 milliseconds or 1 millisecond, depending on the compressor you're using. The attack at 150 the release at 150 milliseconds, and I do not apply any sort of makeup gain. I want to manage all that myself. So the next thing I do is I pop over to the de-esser here, and I will go ahead and play through some of this, and I will adjust the threshold here on the de-esser until I get it to a point where it sounds good, where there's not quite so much sibilance. My voice tends to have quite a bit of sibilance, and especially certain mics tend to emphasize that. The particular mic I used here was an Audio-Technica, and it was not the greatest combination. We did pick up quite a bit of sibilance. So I'll just kind of tweak that up and down until I get it to a point where I like the sound there. So I'll go ahead and process that. You can see it pulled in a lot of those peaks. We now have 6 dB of headroom, but you can see I also bumped this up a little bit. So I'm going to do one more round. I'm going to turn the de-esser off. I've already done that. I don't need to do that again. I'm going to raise the threshold to maybe let's go minus 8 dB. I just want to give myself a tiny bit more headroom. Okay, now we have 7 dB of headroom. That's great. So I'm going to go ahead and bump this to minus 19, process, and that'll get us where we need to be. So we're now at minus 19 with a 1.5 dB of headroom on our true peak. So I ran through that very quick. I realized that's probably too much to follow. What I want to do is reference you over to another episode where we spent a lot more time on it. But this is generally how I do this in Izotope RX with either Nectar or with Ozone. So they both have compressors. Now, if you don't have one of those compressors, you can use any VST plugin with RX or whatever you happen to be using. If you're using Adobe Audition, you can use the included compressors there. If you have something else, you can, whatever your host is. By host, I mean an application that's for editing audio that you want to add a compressor to. You can add of a whole variety. There are so many options out there. Waves, for example, is a very popular option amongst post-audio engineers. So, for example, this is a very popular one, the CLA2A compressor limiter. Right now it's selling for $39. So you can go buy one if you wanted to as well. They have some that are even less expensive. I think they have this one here for $29. In any case, what I would do is try some of them out. Find one that has an interface that you're happy with, that works for you, and that produces a sound that you like. Again, when we're processing dialogue for kind of just naturalistic dialogue, generally we're not doing a lot of our processing is supposed to, in the end, our goal is to sound very transparent. We're just trying to loudness normalize mostly. At least in my case, that's what I'm doing. So I'm just trying to manage the transients, the little peaks, or the really skinny, tall peaks that shoot up. So I'm not trying to change the sound a lot. And a lot of these are kind of focused on, they do analog modeling and things of that nature. That's fine if you're into that. But I don't think it's really necessary to a large extent. I think any sort of good, solid compressor is going to do the job here for what we're trying to accomplish. So, all right. Those were the 2 questions we had this week. Next week, we're going to have another question and answer session. I'll go ahead and send an email out on probably tonight, actually. It's Saturday. I think that's everything for today. So thanks for checking in. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave those down below. I'm not a timecode expert. I know what I know in terms of what I've used. But if any of you have other input on different timecode generators and your experience with them, please leave that information down in the comments below. And we will talk to you again next week. Take care, everyone.